So we're very, very glad to have Professor Talha Muftee here from COMSATS University of Islamabad, but Lahore campus.
Yes.
And he is teaching with us together with the program of UNSW, the University of New South Wales and Tongji Univesrity for the second year design student. And he will be staying here for 2 months, and we take the advantage of what he's saying during the time he stayed here to bring in us 2 lectures, to the series of lectures all about the architecture in Pakistan. And today will be the first one, and we will have the second one next Monday at the same time, same location. And we all hear the students from our course, and we have another audience. 你是哪里来的？你是我们学院的研究生。
我是过来这边交流，那个是中央美术学院。
央美的。Also we have the visiting scholar from CAUP, Beijing.
Yes.
The Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing. And we are very glad to have a public here also, not only us. So the lecture will be around 1 hour.
Yeah, 1 hour.
And we can
questions
have
or
Q&A afterwards.
Yes.
And like discussion. So please.
Okay, thank you. I think I should say about the introduction. So this is the first part, because I wanted to not just directly show architecture of Pakistan, but Pakistan being part of subcontinent has its own history. It goes over thousands of years. Basically, the origin of Pakistan can be connected to the Indus Valley civilization, which again is a very ancient civilization. So in order to understand what is happening in Pakistan, we also need to connect, because Pakistan is something that is not often talked about. You don't see a lot of architecture of Pakistan in books, just maybe selected few architects, few works. So first I want to connect Pakistan to the world history. So Islamic architecture being one of the, not the only, but one of the major elements of Pakistani architecture, and how it's connected to the world history, how it's connected to different civilizations, and how from there we sort of move towards Pakistan. And then next week I will be talking about one of the cities of Pakistan. So this will actually be sort of going through history at a very quick pace. But before I begin, I want to just add a bit something, that Islamic architecture is a very broad subject. It's very extensive, it's very complex, and I'm not in a way an expert on the subject. There are scholars who are specifically studying Islamic architecture, but I have enough expertise in it to basically go over the rules and the principles, the logic of Islamic architecture. So first things first, that what exactly is Islamic architecture, because this term is often misused. It refers to actually this style which started around 7th century, so 600 AD onwards. But it doesn't mean that it's something that originated out of, let's say, Saudi Arabia. Islamic architecture is not Arabic architecture, or it's more actually something else. It's a mixture of a lot of different architecture styles which were already existing in the 7th century. And the evolution and the start of Islamic architecture is very much related to how Islam as a religion started and how it spread in lots of parts of the world. Because right now, currently, Islam is like one of the major religions, if we can sort of count Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism. So like the top, Hinduism of course, because of the demographics. So this is like one of the major religions. And because we're talking about a time period where cultures and civilizations were defined completely by what religion they are based upon. So that way, Islamic architecture has a lot to do with Islam as a religion. And it didn't happen in one place. It started from one point, but then it quickly spread through different continents again, as different, I would say, Muslim armies and conquerors and rulers, they were taking over different parts of the world. So of course, Islamic architecture was evolving along with them. But of course, every continent, every time, every place has its own Islamic architecture. So there is no singular style that defines Islamic architecture, but there are few elements, few principles that you can see, and after that you can quickly identify that, okay, this building or this design is based on Islamic design. Okay, I've already said that Arabic architecture is not Islamic architecture. There's not actually much relationship between the two, because by the time Islamic architecture started, the architecture in Saudi Arabia, which is where the religion started, they had very primitive architecture. They didn't have any defined style. A lot of their culture was based on nomadic lifestyle, like people continuously moving from one place to another and trading along the way. So they didn't really have any, let's say, extensive architecture tradition. And then, because of that, Islamic architecture does not have a style of its own. So it basically it's the result of taking from other cultures, taking from other civilizations, and modifying them, adapting them for their own use. So these are the basic properties of Islamic architecture, the very basic principles. So first of all, that it has a lot to do with symmetry. Like you have the symmetrical axis, the central axis, and elements repeating on either side. So either in terms of direction, that you have symmetry in the y-axis or the x-axis, or rotational symmetry, that you repeat an element along a central point. And then because of that, you have these geometric patterns. So geometric design is a core part of Islamic architecture. You don't see any Islamic architecture which does not follow geometrical rules, geometrical proportions. And then you have these organic ornaments. So organic, by organic I mean visual styles or design elements which are trying to depict nature. So you have these leaf-like floral patterns, maybe some branches of trees, and that kind of ornaments. Those are actually known as the Arabic patterns, because that is like one of the elements which was taken from the from Arabic countries, from Middle East, and then used onwards. And then there's the Arabic calligraphy, a style of writing, and Arabic calligraphy, which is actually a crucial part of the Quran, which is the main book of the Muslim faith. Like you have Bible for Christians, so you have the Quran for Muslims, and that's written in an Arabic language. And even today, Muslims all over the world, they don't actually read translations as much. They actually read the Arabic versions of it. So because of that, the Arabic language and its style is very important to Muslims. So if you actually look at any copy of the Quran, even in China, you will see that the Arabic text is very stylized. It's very beautiful in a lot of books. And that is actually taken as a design element in Islamic architecture. And all of the reasons why you have these text styles and these nature, elements of nature, so much in the design principles, because in the Islamic faith there's actually a problem about representation. Whereas in comparison, when you actually look at other religions, they don't actually have much problem with, let's say, depicting their holy figures. So you have a lot of images of angels, of prophets, of monks, of saints, and even a lot of representation of God. So in Christianity, you see a lot of holy images, a lot of icons, the depiction of Mary and Jesus and angels. In Hinduism, you have all the idols which represent the different holy beings. But in Islam, you actually don't find anything. And that is because the way that the system works is that the Islamic faith is actually against any representation. You all might be aware that there was even a recent controversy with a cartoon contest, and that's the reason why Muslims all over the world had a lot of issues with that context, with that event. But that's a different discussion. Let's not get into that. But basically, human or any life cannot be depicted by Muslims. That's actually part of their faith. And where it comes from is that the belief that Muslims believe that everything is created by the God, where it's the same God as the one in Christianity, and so there's a lot of commonality with other religions. It's not like a completely different set of faith. And because God has created everything, and because this belief that whatever God has created is perfect, and humans are not as perfect as God, so humans cannot recreate what God has already created. That's one of the main reasons. The other reason is that when Islam started, it was competing with the Arabic religions of that time, which were mostly based around idol worship. So problem was that what Muslim leaders in the start, they had this fear that if they allow people to make images of other people or animals, then they will end up worshipping those images, and again, which is against Islam. So they wanted to actually differentiate, have like a different set of rules, so they can have their own system and they can be a distinct culture. So because of that representation rule, you don't see any of that. There are a few examples. I believe in Spain you actually see examples of depictions of people and animals, but in most of Islamic architecture you actually don't see that. So this is actually just a few examples of what Islamic architecture or Islamic design looks like. So like I said, you have this symmetrical system. So you have this one central point, and then you have elements repeating all around it. So you can actually divide this dome of the Süleymaniye Mosque in Turkey, and you can actually divide this into equal portions, and they will all be repeating. So you have the symmetry element, and then you have the geometrical system, which you can actually see in some parts, that you have these regular geometric patterns repeating all over the place, and even where you see these organic elements. So these are the organic elements I was talking about. So you have these leaves and floral patterns, but even then you can see them that they're sort of contained in a hexagon, or this main design element is contained within a circle. So you see a lot of such forms and such geometries in Islamic architecture. This example is, of course, of a much later period. So this I would say is when Islamic architecture had already evolved a lot. And then you have the calligraphy element. So these all parts that you see, they're actually Arabic text taken from Quran, the main book of the Muslims, and then sort of stylized in a way to actually make it part of the design. So you can actually see how the text is disordered. It's not, of course, it's not very clear to read, because right here the text is used only as a design element. And that's only because they can't create images of angels, they can't create images of the prophets, so they actually do these kind of things. And I will sort of get into the reasons and how that came to be. So you actually have these structural elements, again, with a geometric modular system. So the first thing that any built environment. Now, because in this lecture I don't want to just talk about Islamic architecture, I also want to talk about some things which you can relate to when studying any other form of architecture, any form of historical style, or how cultures define architecture. Because our built environment is basically because of how we see the world around us, how we understand the world around us. So this collective knowledge of maybe a group of people, a society, or any culture. That is the defining factor, that how the architecture of that group is going to be. And of course, if the group is already existing within an architectural built environment, so that's also going to change the way they see the world around them. So this exchange of information between people and the built environment, that is what actually makes these changes in the built environment over time. Of course, times have now really changed if we compare, of course, 21st century to the 7th century. That information flow between people and the built environment, or within one society and another, there are no barriers today. So for example, if something else is happening in one corner of the world, it doesn't take any time at all that we are able to see it, understand it, and maybe that also changes the way we think. And so because of this fluid exchange of information, it actually can create a problem when you're going through history of architecture, especially going back towards 3rd century, 4th century, because you don't have that free exchange of information. So you have to take these limitations in mind. That the first limitation is when you're studying any ancient form of architecture or any ancient city, is that the mode of transportation. Because right now our information is not related to mode of transport. We have the internet, but for the most time of human history, information was actually dependent upon your mode of transportation. So for example, if the fastest way you can travel is by ships, then that's the fastest way for information to travel. So what would happen is that any information would actually take days and months to reach another point. So there was not a lot of communication going on between these societies, not many exchange of ideas. So that's why in history you actually see these very contained, very unique civilizations and societies that can be identified by their own style. And as soon as you look at another part of the world, everything changes. But just by looking at the built environment, you're actually able to recognize yourself, that where exactly in the world are you. But now everything has sort of mixed up. Like I was actually telling one of my friends that in Shanghai, you can actually go to different parts, the French concessions and the European parts, and there you don't actually realize that you're still in Shanghai. You can just take a picture and no one else would be able to tell that that's actually within China. But back then, of course, that was not the case because transportation modes were limited. There are even historical incidents where, let's say, two civilizations are at war and one loses. So by the time they actually get that information that they have lost the war, the other army is already there because they're all traveling at the same speed. I think even Game of Thrones actually talks about it a lot of times. So you have only two situations in which architecture changes or the built environment changes or people exchange ideas. That is either war or commerce. So by commerce I mean trade. So any civilizations that were trading with one another, so they were easily able to exchange ideas, but at a very small scale, at a very slow speed. The major changes only happened when you had wars between civilizations. So one group of people taking over, conquering another group of people, and then the built environment completely changes. So because any state, any nation in history, for most of the history, has been defined by what they believe in, their ideology and their belief. So whenever this shift in power would happen, okay, this society or group of people either losing to another army or maybe taking over another state. So what the first thing would be to do is to actually, you want to, as a civilization, you want to make sure that everyone else acknowledges you as a power. And the best way to do that would be to actually build things, to change the built environment based on your beliefs and your ideas. That's how you know that there's now a different ruler or a different point of state in that region. So typically what would happen is, let's suppose I have an army, you have an army, and I would take over your village or your town, city, or state. So what I would do is I would actually take my architectural style, my aesthetic tradition, and I would actually impose over you. I will use that as a political tool to actually take control. So people who are now under my rule, now they are in a built environment that I created, so they are automatically my subjects. That's what's been happening for most of the time. But with Islam, that's a very different situation, because like I said, Islamic architecture did not have any defined architectural style. So if they had to take over, they didn't actually have something to build there. So instead of bringing in their own architecture style, they actually started making other kinds of changes in the built environment as they went on conquering different cities. This is an idea, what I call the conceptual filter, a sort of filter that makes these decisions, these subconscious decisions, that if you're going to use or maybe adapt some other parts of in a built environment which is not your own, so which parts do you take and which parts do you refuse? And that is again based upon what you believe in or how you see the world, because what our experience is, they define certain concepts in our subconscious level. So that would actually be the main force which would decide what to keep and what not to keep. So Islamic conquerors, they already had their conceptual filter because they had a specific set of rules, they had a system of belief, they had the Arabic culture with them. So they had a specific framework already in their minds which helped them to see the world around them. So the collective conceptual framework of the conquering entity, so any army which is taking over, it perceives the newly attained built environment from its own perspective. And what then it does is that it starts making changes according to its conceptual filter. So the Islamic conceptual filter, like I said, is that it has to do with the belief system. So first of all, Islam is a monotheistic religion. Monotheistic means that you have this only one singular divine entity or God, and everything else is just a creation. And the God, which is in Arabic is pronounced as Allah, is the source of all creation. You just have only one creator, only one God, and he is responsible for every creation for the entire universe. And then man, being a creation of God, cannot recreate what God has already created. So that's also how the rule about representation works. So this is the main conceptual filter. So any new place that the Muslims conquered, they actually had to change the built environment based on these rules. So the Dome of Rock, this is what you can say the first ever example of Islamic architecture. This is where most of the architecture rules were established. So it's situated in Jerusalem right now, in the region where Palestine and Israel is. And this is not only an important site for Islam, but also for Christianity and Judaism. And it was built around 691. So you have kind of the end of the 7th century. And Caliph Abdul Malik, he was the, you can say, the main ruler of the entire Islamic civilization. And this is the first time that what Muslims, what they did was actually take elements from other cultures and other religions and other regions and sort of made their own. So the Islamic architecture is actually a modification of the Byzantine architecture, which was already existing at that time. So in a way, what the Christian civilizations had already developed, the Muslims actually took that and changed it according to their belief system, and then they called it, and basically that's what Islamic architecture is. And that was very easy to do because there's actually a lot of overlap between Christian faith and Islam. Muslims actually consider Christians to be having almost the same set of religion and as not many differences. They believe in the same God, they believe in the same prophets. So it actually made sense for them to take from Christian traditions of architecture and the built environment. So that's what they did. When the Caliph, Caliph Abdul Malik, when his forces actually took over Jerusalem, because this is when Islamic religion was new and they were actually looking to expand into different regions. So as soon as they conquered Jerusalem, they needed a monument to show the people around them that now there's going to be a new ruler or there's going to be a new religious center. So what they did was they actually looked at Byzantine architecture and took those elements. So of course to build that, because you have an army, you don't have the entire society, the entire group of people moving into this new country. So of course they had to hire local architects or local craftspeople. And the local architects and the craft people only knew the traditional styles of that region. So of course they were going to build something that was already pretty common in that region. And what they did was they actually took existing churches, because those were the main religious buildings, main monuments of the built environment. They actually used those churches, not just metaphorically, that they just saw the churches and took the style. They actually physically took the churches. They destroyed a lot of churches. They took that material, the columns, stone, and they actually reused that to make their own buildings. And of course, when you see this type of structure now, because a lot has changed, the first image that comes to mind is that of a mosque. The mosque being the religious worship place for the Muslims. And now it's very easy to see that resemblance, because now it's very typical for mosques to have this kind of proportions, this dome structure on the top. But in reality, this Dome of Rock, this first ever building of Islamic architecture, is not a mosque. It's simply a monument, because this place had its own importance in the religion. It has various relationships to all the three religions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. So this is simply a monument. This is not actually a place of worship. This is from the inside. So this is actually the main, the old excavated rock, which has the religious importance, and you have these arcades and columns and arches going all around. So you can actually see that influence from the Western civilizations. You can actually see the columns that they're actually taken from classical or Hellenistic tradition, more Greek rather than Islamic or Middle Eastern. And even the arches, these arches were pretty much there in Byzantine architecture by the time Muslims came here. So they simply just took those elements. And of course, the changes they made, that they would instruct the local architect or the local craftspeople that we're not allowed to have human or animal figures, so you have to make flowers and nature and leaves and floral patterns. So the same people who were making mosaic images of angels or holy figures, they were now doing this kind of stuff. So you have that skill now used for a different purpose. And you can see the Arabic text on top. And here are the different elements which were used from the existing churches. So this is actually one of the columns on the outside of Dome of Rock. And these are the parts which were actually taken, like literally taken from other churches. So they would destroy the church and bring those materials there. So you don't see any of these elements now, because Islamic architecture didn't change. Now, then they developed their own column styles, their own patterns, their own arches. But this is where it all started. And here you can actually see the source of inspiration. So on the left you have the Church of the Holy Spirit. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. So you have this 4th century church on the left side, and you can actually see that you have a similar dome, similar proportions on the right hand side in the Dome of Rock. And this is actually what historians believe the actual inspiration for this structure. So that's where they got the idea of the dome. And even the plan, the Dome of Rock is actually based on an octagon. And the octagonal plan was already being used a lot in Christian churches before that. So you have actually these two main examples, this 4th century church and this 5th century church, and then you have the 7th century Dome of Rock. So you can actually see that even inside the spatial planning is done in a similar way. So you have this major octagonal plan, and then you have this path of circulation which goes around the central space. Sort of arcade which is defined by the columns within. Another element that the Islamic architecture had was the minaret. If the Dome of Rock only is known for its the unique element which is related to Islamic architecture is the dome. But another element which is very common in Islamic architecture is the minaret or the tower. It literally means a tower, but of course historians have arguments about the actual meaning of the word. This was usually used in the main religious or the worship centers, also known as the mosque. The purpose of this was to actually have a signal, because Muslims, what they do is, depending on the day of time, depending on the movement of the sun, they actually pray 5 times every day. And for that they need someone to basically tell the locals that it's time for prayer. So what they do is they basically have a human voice, sort of in Arabic recitation, to tell everyone else that it's time to pray. And where did that come from? Of course, again, when Islam was being defined at a very early stage, they needed something, a symbol or a signal for the local. So there were discussions about whether they should use bells, but already Christians were using bells. So they just needed something which was not being already used by any other religion. So they decided that it's just going to be a human voice, any local person who would go up to this high point, so that that person is easily visible and easily can be heard, and that person would basically in a loud voice call to other people. That was the purpose of the tower, of the minaret. But now it's pretty much a monument. You still see the structure now, but it's not used in that way, because now you have loudspeakers, you have everyone has a clock, right? So everyone can know by themselves when it's the time for prayer. So you don't actually need these towers anymore. So right now these towers pretty much exist as monuments, as decorative elements. And even these towers, they were actually taken from Syrian churches, because Syrian churches, the one you can see at the left, I mean, you can actually still see that overlap between a typical Muslim mosque and this Syrian Asian church. You have the dome and the tower. This is now associated with mosque, but back then it was something that Christians did in a lot of Middle Eastern regions. So they actually took that idea of a tower and simply just removed the bell and had it big enough so that some person could climb upwards and just simply call out to other people. So on the left you have a 5th century Syrian church complex, and on the right you have this mosque in Africa from 9th century. There are, of course, I'm going to be very, I'm going to jump between a lot of centuries, because there's so much stuff in between. Can't actually do that. And another example of how they borrow different elements, that conceptual filter that worked. This was another instance. Of course, it happened much later on. This was in Turkey. So you have the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Turkey. It's still considered like an architecture marvel because of its the proportions of its dome and how it came to be. It has a very extensive history as a place of worship for the Christian faith, and then as a mosque. So it has actually 2 different timelines. And again, same story. You have this theme pretty much not just in Islamic architecture, but in all sorts of architecture styles and times where architecture is closely related to religion. That architecture would change as soon as a war would end. A lot of religions actually spread on basis of military conquest, and that was pretty much a common theme. So another example, that when Muslims took over at that time Constantinople, so the first one of the major monuments at that time was the Hagia Sophia, and they actually took over the church. And it was not exactly a peaceful takeover. A lot of people were killed. There are historical records showing that people who were worshipping inside the church were actually slaughtered by the forces. So there's no reason to romanticize or to pretend that none of that happened. This was, any historical architecture is related to violence in one way or the other. So again, because the Muslims wanted to show that now there are the major power in that area, what they did was they simply made changes to the Hagia Sophia. And they added these. Of course, I just photoshopped it for a dramatic effect. Just to show what's the difference between the two. So all of a sudden it turns into this image that everyone can recognize as a mosque. You have these minaret towers. Again, they are more decorational. You can actually see that they are now very slim and very tall. They're not exactly comfortable for someone to actually physically go up and then call to other people. No one would be able to hear anyone. But now these are sort of just monuments, and whenever you would see this combination of a tower and a dome, you will understand that, oh, Muslims are here. This is a religious center of Islam. And that's where it did. And what happened was, because of these continuous changes to different Christian structures, they created this typology, this form, which was a combination of different forms, and now it means something else. So it's not like that they built these things from scratch. Nothing in architecture is actually built from scratch. It always is an idea which is taken from somewhere else, an experience, and then it's changed according to how you understand the built environment and how do you behave in the world. And then you have the geometrical parts of Islam, because that's a very crucial part of Islamic architecture. These regular and repeating patterns, which is used as a decorative element in Islamic architecture. You can actually see them in tiles, in structures, in facades, in flooring, everywhere. And even here, even the reason for geometry is simply the ideology of the Muslims, of the things that they believed in, or what the history of Islam was. And like I said, they were not allowed to have any human representation, so they needed a way to translate creation. Like that was sort of their way of bypassing the rule. Okay, if I can't create what God has already created, maybe I can create a symbol which represents that idea. So they were sort of having this form of abstraction amongst themselves. Like in a way how form is sort of an abstraction of different ideas, of different concepts. So they were actually doing that at that time. So geometry becomes an abstract representation of God's creations. So any geometric representation, it represents the universe in a way. It's not just simply that it looks good or it's aesthetically very pleasing, but because Muslims believe that that pattern is actually a symbol for all of the reality, the heavens, the earth, and everything else which is contained within reality. And because Muslims believe that God's creation are completely pure and perfect, so the geometric patterns have to be perfect and regular. So they have to have the same kind of qualities they believe that God's creation has. So that's why symmetry and regular patterns are very crucial in Islamic architecture. Another reason for geometry being so used and being so actually spiritually important for Muslims is that even the rituals are based around geometrical patterns. So for example, here you have the image of the Kaaba, which is situated in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. This is their main center of worship, which Muslims consider as the house of God. Of course, not in a literal sense. It's a symbolic house of God. It's his sort of presence, this monument of God on earth. This was again a structure which Arabic cultures and pagan religions were already using, but as soon as the Islamic prophet Muhammad with his forces, he took over Mecca, they actually changed the structure. They removed all the idols and used it for their own worship. So this is actually a granite structure, which is not exactly a perfect cube, but it has rectangular proportions, and it's considered the most important building for Muslims. So important that the Saudi government doesn't even allow non-Muslims to enter the city. They don't even issue a visa or anything. So that's how the importance of that is. There are also political implications of that today. But one of the main rituals of the Muslim is the pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is again a very common ritual. It's done in different religions in different manners. And the Muslim pilgrimage has this important feature called the CAUP. This is an Arabic word in which what they do is they actually walk around the Kaaba, the central cubical structure, and they actually walk for multiple number of times to complete the pilgrimage. So you have this center of rotation, and then people moving around it, and in the center you have this very simple geometrical object, and then you have circles around it. So in a way, the geometry is an inherent part of the Muslim faith, the Muslim ritual, and because of this, it sort of connects Muslims to geometry. So they understand geometry not in logical sense, but they are also connected to it emotionally. Even like I said, even the prayers that Muslims have to do 5 times a day, even that has to be in the exact direction as the central Kaaba. So they actually have to have this perfect orientation anywhere in the world. So every mosque around the world is actually orientated towards Saudi Arabia, and that's the direction that all Muslims pray in. So when you have this sort of geometrical system, a main part of the day-to-day practice. So what happens is that Muslims, they feel connected to the geometrical patterns. They understand that at a very emotional level. They're connected to it consciously and subconsciously. So that's also the reason that they needed those geometrical patterns. So every Muslim would have a sense of direction, a Cartesian system in their minds, and that's how they basically practice their faith. So these are like one of the few reasons why geometry is so important to Islam. And then apart from that, even one of the main things which is promoted in the Islamic faith is the exploration of science. So science has been a major part and a very important part of Muslim faith historically. Of course, now things are a lot different and things are much more complicated. But back in the day, this was actually considered an important part of faith to actually acquire as much scientific knowledge as possible. This is even a text from the Quran that verily, all things that we have, this is God speaking to man. All things that have we created in proportion and measure. So this is basically God telling Muslims that everything that I have created is based on a logical system, is based on scientific principle, is based upon a proportion system. So the Muslims being so closely already, because of their practice, already connected to geometry, so they needed to explore this more, and they needed more scientific knowledge. So that's one thing that Muslims for a lot of time were actually very good at, in exploring maths, science, algebra, calculus, all those things. So this scientific research and understanding the universe, that is actually what helped the Muslims to understand and refine these geometrical principles. Because what Muslims believe is that the more you understand the universe and how it's created and the physics and the science behind it, the more you are closer to understanding God. The more you are closer spiritually to God. So that's why for Muslims it was very important to actually do that. So even from the 8th to 14th century, which is in Western history often referred to as the Dark Ages, this time period when there was actually very little progress in science, it was the Muslim civilizations which were actually conducting most of the research in mathematics and science at that time. You can actually see even some of the explorations of planetary motion, of cosmic understanding, of how the Earth, Sun and Moon are related, of eclipse. These are actually all from Muslim scholars. So in that time period, what they had done is that they had actually collected all the knowledge, all the scientific knowledge from other civilizations, especially the Greek and classical knowledge, philosophy, medicine, science, and they translated that into Arabic, and then they even started exploring more. So a lot of scientific achievements were done by Muslims in that time period. Things like surgery, algebra is even named after an Arabic scholar. Calculus, trigonometry, all these things which define geometry, form, cosmic understanding. So how is that actually practiced? Because you have to also understand the fact that Muslim architects and craft people who were actually creating these geometric patterns, they didn't have many advanced tools. They only had maybe like a pen or maybe a compass, and not many tools after that, because there are no computers or machines at that time. So that's the entire design was actually based on circular motion, on circles and arcs and intersection. And how that geometric pattern translates to belief is this just one example which I've illustrated here, that they always start with a point because they believe in one God. So everything actually originates from one point. So that the point, any center of any geometrical form, it represents the will of God and the point of origin of being. Of course, now when Muslim scholars study the Big Bang Theory, they actually try to make the same connections, that how the universe actually started from one point in space and time and then expanded. So, of course, but that's not maybe the best way to go about it, but since there was this belief that there's only one creator of the universe, so everything has to come from one point. Everything has to grow from this one point. And then the first thing you do from that point is actually draw a circle. In the same pattern that the Muslims have their the pilgrimage, the rituals in that circle. And circle for the Muslim faith, it mainly represents unity of everything, of the entire universe, of entire creation. And because circle is considered as a geometrical element having infinite sides, so that concept of infinity and circle being related to the Muslim faith. So the circle represents everything that has been created and everything which is pure, everything which represents the universe. And by overlapping those circles, you start having these multiple creations which are connected to each other. And you just keep on multiplying the different circles, and from one circle you actually come to the number 6, which represents in some ways the 6 days of creation, because Muslims believe that God created the world in 6 days, similar to the Christian faith. And you have these 6 points, intersection points, after repeating the circle, after repeating that symbol of the universe. And with those 6 points, you actually get this hexagon, again based on the 6 points. And by intersecting that hexagon with the points, with the floral pattern beneath, and creating 2 triangles, you get the seal of Solomon, another very, I would say, a significant symbol for the Muslim faith. So they start from a point, and then they create circles, and then they create these geometrical patterns. So this actually shape you can see pretty much everywhere in Islamic architecture throughout time. This is a very common geometrical pattern. And then you start repeating that pattern by connecting different patterns and constantly overlapping them. And what's it doing is, like, in terms of the Muslim faith, what's it doing is that now you're understanding the whole universe as this connection of creation, that every person, every being is connected to one another, and all that starts from the one point, which is God. And when you start repeating everything, so that means you're sort of going into infinity. Because at that time, the overall cosmic understanding was that the universe is pretty much infinite. This is, of course, before modern physics, so it was usually believed that the universe is infinite. So in geometrical patterns, if you repeat them for long enough, and you create this illusion of infinity, so that means that you are closer to understanding your faith. And this is a very simple diagram. I'm going to show you guys some of the patterns, and you can actually see the level of complexity in those patterns. But even in those complex patterns, the principles and the rules are same. It's the point, the circle, and the intersection of the circle. So here you have a pattern taken from Egypt. So on the right hand side, you can see that there's a lot of stuff going on. You can actually see some fractal patterns, you can see some organic patterns, but the method of construction is still the same. It's still starting from one point and a circle and repeating that circle. No matter how complex the pattern gets, the rules are the same. It's the same mathematical logic which is actually defining those patterns. And these rules were actually taken very seriously. You don't see any Islamic geometric patterns breaking away from the rules. So you have, for example, in this case, you have these two overlapping squares. So one square represents the earth, and the other square represents the heaven. And when you combine them, so you have these the physical and spiritual world combined together, and then repeating that again into infinity. And all this is simply a way for Muslims to practice their faith in a visual way, because they can't create the exact images what God has created. So they have this logic based on geometry and their scientific exploration and their mathematics of how they can represent their understanding of the universe. Even when you have these purely floral patterns without any geometrical shapes, even then you can actually see that how the overall frame is divided into even spaces and how a module is being repeated. So even then, even when you have non-geometrical elements, even they are following the same geometrical repetition patterns. So you have a pattern so complex that you can't clearly see that how even this pattern is based upon a circle. Again, that level of complexity is meant to represent that how behind everything you see, there is a hidden logical system, which is very simple, which is very basic. And if you keep on adding layers, you reach this level of complexity that you see in the universe. A lot of mathematicians ever since, even today, they have been studying these patterns, sort of creating a classification system. So there are actually mathematicians researching these pattern systems, and they have actually decoded these patterns and how you can actually categorize them based on the geometrical patterns. So in a way, this is where Islamic pattern actually connects to, let's say, parametric systems. Because even in the parametric system, you have a simple logic, and then you simply change the variables and you achieve a different result. So all of the Islamic patterns, in a way, are parametric systems. And this is just one example of how the different pattern types, based on their symmetry, based on their complexity, have been classified by different researchers ever since. Now this is a level of complex design. This is what is usually called the dual level design. So the dual level design is basically you have one geometrical system, one proportion system, and then you actually add a different system at a different scale on top of it to actually increase the level of complexity. again, this was being done in a time when without any computers, and they had very simple calculations, and the only tools they had were your basic drawing tools, your ruler, your pen, your set square, and the compass. And they were able to explore all of these designs manually. So here, for example, here you can see you have this larger system of polygons, and then you have this smaller scale system. The main purpose of this complexity was to have different types of experience. So when you're approaching this complex pattern from, let's say, a distance, it looks at something else. But as soon as you move in closer, you start seeing the smaller patterns, and the experience completely changes. So in a way, that journey towards understanding the universe, that is being done in a literal way. Now this is an actual example of a dual level design. So you have two different levels. It's very difficult to see after completion and how this might be constructed. But if you start maybe decoding it visually, then you can actually see the line of symmetry, you can actually see patterns repeating all the way through. Even this example in Iran. So from far away, you won't actually see this level of detail. This would only appear as a color blue. And as soon as you move in closer, like how you, have you ever seen those interactive videos where you're sort of zooming into the universe and then the atom, and each level has a different detail? So that's what they were trying to do with these geometric patterns, that as you move in closer, even more details, more rules, and even more logic becomes clear. And now we come to Pakistan. This is the branch of, because Islam was being spread in a lot of continents, so that means that you have as many different kinds of Islamic architecture. You have the Moorish Islamic architecture, you even have the Chinese Islamic architecture known as the Sino-Islamic architecture. And then in Pakistan you have the Indo-Islamic, because Pakistan and India were pretty much labeled as India for a long time. So you have the Indo-Islamic architecture. And so in Pakistan, Islam was being spread through trade. Basically, Arabic merchants coming in to trade with people and then living in India or Pakistan, and then slowly spreading the faith, their ideas. But of course, that always happens at a very slow speed. So the only time that Islam was actually really taking over Pakistan was when different military leaders started coming to Pakistan and started taking over. And this was mainly done from the Persian side. Persia, which is now Iran, is pretty much close to Pakistan, and also Afghanistan. So these were already parts of the Muslim civilization at that point, and from there, different leaders, different rulers, different dynasties started taking over different cities and parts of Pakistan. So the Islamic architecture in Pakistan is actually taken from the Persian Islamic architecture. So it's actually one style evolving after the other. But of course, unlike the previous examples, we have seen that simply taking over church, adding towers and maybe an extra dome and then turning into a mosque, that sort of thing never happened here. Because when the Muslim conquerors came here, what they saw was that the built environment, which was made by the Hindus at that time, because Hinduism was the major religion, Hinduism and Buddhism, none of the ideas matched with Islam. They were like complete opposites. So they could not borrow anything. They could not borrow much because it did not make sense to them at a subconscious level. They had overlaps with Christianity or Judaism, but every element of the Hindu faith was completely in opposite direction. The Hindu faith has multiple gods, multiple divine beings. It's a polytheistic religion, so Islam can't basically agree with that. And then Hinduism is filled and rich with physical representation of gods in different idols and images. Again, that's something that the Muslims could not agree with. So, and even the way they designed their temples. So the Hindu temples were actually made to worship one idol. So you have an idol in a very dimly lit space at the end of a corridor in a very minute space. And whereas the Muslim ritual was based upon these open courtyards and having these groups of people worshipping at the same time. So these differences is because of these reasons, the conceptual filter which the Muslims had worked in the opposite direction. So they did not borrow much from the Hindu tradition. They actually simply used the Persian tradition, and they basically started using that on top of the Indian built environment of the time. And of course, because Pakistan being so far away from the center of Islam, it took a lot of time for Islam to reach Pakistan. So by that time, Islamic architecture had kind of its own traditions. So this is an example of an Indian temple in somewhere around the 5th century. So none of the visual elements resemble either the Byzantine traditions or anything that the Muslims were already building. No domes, a lot of visual imagery of human figures, of anthropomorphic beings. So this is why the Muslims of that time did not take any major elements from the Hindu architecture. And this happened around the 10th and 11th century. Multan was the major center, the major city in Pakistan, which is where Islamic architecture of Pakistan started gaining its roots. Multan is also known as the region where Alexander the Great actually came to India, and this is where his campaigns started slowing down, and this is where he's kind of turned back. So Multan again has a very ancient history, and by 10th and 11th century, this was actually one of the first parts of Pakistan which was taken over by Muslim rulers, and this is where they started building their first structures. Again, they did take some elements. It's of course not as much as they did before, but why did they take those elements? Was simply because they could not afford to bring in all the architects, all the designers and craftspeople from Persia, so they had to basically, it was more feasible and economical to hire the local designers, local architects and local craftspeople with their instructions of how Islamic architecture should be. And of course then you would have this new kind of Islamic architecture which would be related to that context and that region. So for example, in this ancient tomb, this is a 12th century tomb made by Muslims. You actually see a similar ornamental detail which was actually found in Hindu temples at the time. This is not something that was found in Persian architecture or Middle Eastern architecture, but this is something more specific to Hindu traditions. The tombs were basically one of the new introduction to architecture typology that took place in this region and this time. Before this, you don't see many tombs being built, but in Multan you actually start seeing around the 12th and 13th century. You start seeing these massive buildings being constructed for one person with a grave inside. The reason was that you had these Islamic scholars, I would say the parallel of a priest. So these Islamic scholars who would teach people about Islam, and they would live in the same place, and after they died, people would simply build these monuments in their memory. So the tombs of Multan is something that was new at the time. And this is a defining feature of Multan. It's actually Multan being the entry point of Islam in Pakistan. It's actually called Madinatul Awliya, which means city of saints, because you had so many Islamic leaders and scholars discussing philosophy and religion in that region, and that you have many tombs in this region. But even here you see this sort of a very Persian style. A lot of the fresco, the tile work, the proportions, they're actually directly derived from Persian architecture. It's still not mature enough to be called as Pakistani Islamic architecture. This is one of the first major tombs that was built in Multan. This is the tomb of Bahauddin Zakaria. It's a 13th century. He was one of the main prominent scholars of his time. And this is pretty much based upon Persian traditions of architecture at the time. This is the dome from the inside. So you have this large 3-level open space, the dome on top, in this octagonal structure, and the dome transferring all the load on this octagonal structure, and then a square base. All of the tile work, this blue tile work taken from lapis lazuli, this was actually pretty much a traditional art practice in Persia, and that's how they started using this color and this kind of tile work. The next important structure, which was pretty much, even though it was just made 50 years after the first tomb, this is the, sorry, this label is entirely incorrect. This is the tomb of Shah Rukh Alam. You can actually see a lot of changes in the details and the planning and the proportion. Now, this is starting to move away from Persian traditions and starting to maybe turn into something more regional, something which is belonging to this place, something which people living here are developing on their own. So this is the tomb of Shah Rukh Alam. There's only like a 50-year difference between this structure and this one. This is a section and a plan of this. So you have this tapering structure. There are multiple theories of why this structure is tapering. One is, of course, that it was structurally more stable, and the other is that Muslims, because they were pretty much involved in different wars at this time, so they were building a lot of forts. And because forts have these kinds of inclined walls, they were actually using that design element in all of their religious structures. I have a personal connection with this building because more than 10 years ago when I was a student and I had to take admission in an architecture school, usually they have this interview process where they ask students, okay, what is your favorite architecture building? And everyone around me had the same kind of building, Frank Lloyd Wright or Le Corbusier or some, so I needed something different. So I just started searching for buildings and I came across this. So I was fully prepared to tell them that this is my favorite architecture. And I had very basic reasons because I did not know much about architecture, that it's a 100-feet span with no column and it's a complete load-bearing structure. But unfortunately, that question never came up. These are some close-up details of the, but these pictures don't really do much justice to the immense scale, the proportion, and the geometrical detailing that goes inside this tomb. So you have the same kind of frescoes, the same kind of patterns, the same kind of geometric principles. Again, you see the same rules, the rules of symmetry, the rules of repetition, that rule of in using infinity. I even have like a short video clip, but I don't think that we have enough time for that. That's basically just footage of this tomb. This is again one of the closer regions to Multan and some of the leftover tombs. Of course, these tombs were not taken care of by people, by locals, or by the government, and it's sad to see a lot of these tombs have been lost because Multan, this whole region, was filled with such structures and each having a unique style, a unique identity of its own. But a lot of these structures are either collapsed or now there are efforts to restore them. The next major part, which is basically the final chapter in Islamic architecture in Pakistan, is the Mughal architecture. They were basically the rulers of this region for about 300 years, from 1526 to 1857. Again, they were basically Central Asian rulers who came from Afghanistan and Persia, and they took over India. They actually pretty much ruled the entire India for 300 years, one generation after the other. And their rule basically ended when the British colonized the entire region in 1857. So they also brought in some Persian traditions, but they were the main reasons why Indo-Islamic architecture created its own identity after many years. Because the Mughals were actually able to spend a lot of time in this region, so they were able to develop a new visual language which was completely different from Persian tradition or other architecture styles in the Middle East. And they built massive projects. They built a lot of gardens, forts, mosques, and everything was huge at a very grand scale because they really wanted to get acknowledged that they are the central power of the region. So the Indo-Islamic architecture, which is the Pakistani variant of Islamic architecture, it's very huge in scale, and I have one or two examples of that. So you can actually see, like, compared to the previous tombs and the mosques, which are pretty much smaller in scale, now they're just pushed into, they had a lot of resources, they had a lot of money, and they had, of course, a lot of people working for them. So they were able to undertake most of these projects. One of the ideas that the Mughals introduced in this region, which was not being practiced here, was the Charbagh. Charbagh basically literally means four gardens, which is again a reference to this story in the Islamic text that paradise is basically made up of four gardens. You actually see similar ideas about gardens and heavens even in other religions and regions. I believe even in Feng Shui or even in Chinese landscape traditions, you actually see such references, that the landscape design is kind of dependent upon the spiritual traditions of that time and place. So this literal meaning of four gardens was translated into landscape design by Mughal designers, and they simply, what they did was they had this two-axis system dividing any landscape design into four equal parts, having a water of body in the center and then having water channels run through the four gardens. And what they would do is they would actually change the heights so that you would have water flowing under the force of gravity from one point to the other. So this was actually being practiced in Iran and Afghanistan at the time, and the Mughals brought it to Pakistan. So on the left you have the Shalimar Garden, which is based in Lahore. This is a very old Mughal example of the Charbagh or the four garden system. And on the right you have this Persian painting showing how the lifestyle was supposed to be, because the purpose of these gardens was simply to have a place of relaxation for visitors, for ambassadors, for rulers of the state. So this was basically where important people would gather around, have poetry, music, maybe have a feast, and just have a good time. Another reason was that it is usually stated in historical records that when Muslim rulers took over this region, they really hated the weather. So they wanted to have a nice garden with lots of trees and shade where they could easily relax and get away from the local climate. This is a Mughal tomb. Now, in comparison to the tombs that I've already shown, you can actually see the change in scale, the change in proportion. Still based on the same principles, but now the proportions are completely changed because it's Mughals now, and they love everything to be grand and imperial, and they really want themselves to be remembered after centuries. So this is a 17th century tomb of Jahangir. This is basically the front of the tomb. This has only one grave in it, and the entire structure is just for that one person. This is the main entrance to the tomb, and you can actually see that by 17th century, the level of complexity that they have achieved in terms of pattern making. Like started with very simple hexagonal patterns with very simple circles, and now they are even beyond dual level designs and designs which are very hard to decode. One major thing that it changed was the use of material. The Mughals, they started this tradition of using local materials such as the red sandstone and using that with marble. I'm sure a lot of you have seen images of Taj Mahal, this white grand building with the domes and the minarets. But that's completely made in marble, and that comes much later as compared to the tomb of Jahangir. So this is where they actually started experimenting with marble, and they started doing that more and more. And you have these very, even the organic patterns, they seem to be even more realistic than before, resembling their studies of still life, their studies of nature. So you actually see that within those patterns and frescoes, you can actually see that how their own arts was evolving, how their own understanding of nature was changing over time. This is again inside the tomb of Jahangir on the right hand side. This is the main gateway. This is the main entrance, which is right outside the gardens of the tomb. And on the left you have the tomb itself completely made in marble. And even on the tomb you have this kind of ornamentation going around based on the same geometrical patterns, the same ideas of using Arabic text as an ornamentation system. The next example is one of the biggest mosques which was made at the time. Well, actually the biggest mosque of its time, and still considered as one of the biggest one in entire Asia. This is the Badshahi Mosque, which the Mughals built around 17th century. Same materials, they are using red sandstone with bits of marble in them. And even the way the marble is organized, it's done in a very fixed proportion system. So you have these modular shapes repeating one after the another, and everything needs to be evenly divided based on symmetry. And just by looking at these images, you can actually see that change in scale that they went with, even the main courtyard. This is still one of the biggest courtyards of any mosque in the world. Kind of reminds you of the palace from Aladdin, if anyone has seen that movie, the typical Middle Eastern architecture. This is the entrance. So you have this grand entrance opening up to a huge courtyard, and even the courtyard again, you can actually see a water channel dividing the place evenly into pieces. So everything has to be symmetrical. Again, an increased level of detailing, more refined. Of course, not many vibrant colors as before, but now they were now creating something new, something which was not being made before in any other region. So you can say that even though they kind of decreased the visual intensity of the colors and materials, they were now making something in a more mature manner. Something which now can be identified as Indo-Islamic architecture and not related to any other tradition. This is a three-dimensional structural system overlaid with a two-dimensional geometric system. And this is all done manually. So you have now they're even breaking away from flat geometric patterns. They are now moving towards non-Euclidean geometry or non-Euclidean structures. Some close-up details of the ornamentation that they were developing. A lot more focus on the floral patterns or the plant-based ornamentation. But then in 1857, Britishers colonized Pakistan, and that's where the Islamic tradition declined at a very fast pace, because it was now completely changed in the government system. So of course the Britishers were the major decision makers of what needs to be built and what needs to be skipped. And they pretty much ruled for almost a century. So Pakistan basically got free from colonial rule in 1947. And so when you have a century of another ruler, so of course all the previous traditions were going to be damaged. So by the time Pakistan started off as a country, Islamic architecture was pretty much gone. It had almost disappeared. Even now the major examples of Islamic tradition are from the Mughal time. So Pakistani architects haven't been able to make anything in that tradition. This is one of the first monuments that was built in Pakistan based on that Islamic tradition. So this can, a lot of architecture experts actually see this as going backwards, because of course you don't have any of the understanding of architecture left, you don't have any of the traditions left, you don't have any of the skilled people left from that time. So of course anything that you're going to make, you're pretty much going back in time. This is just a monument, this is not a religious building. This monument was basically made in memory of the political party, the major political party which was responsible for the independence and partition. This is called the Minar-e-Pakistan, or simply the Tower of Pakistan. Based on the same idea of the tower as the mosque, but because the tower was not functional for a long time, even this is simply a monument. It's not related to any religious practice, it's not related to any mosque. This is simply a monument to basically commemorate or celebrate a political victory. So you have a kind of modern take on Islamic architecture, this very minimalistic approach. So you have some sort of curved surfaces based on floral patterns. You have the idea of symmetry and proportional division, but you don't have that kind of ornamentation or that kind of detail which was being done in the Mughal time. And now the only major mosque done after that is the Islamabad mosque, which is called the Faisal Mosque. It's named after King Faisal of Saudi Arabia because he was the main, how shall I say, the main financial supporter of this mosque. So this was built around 1985, and around this time modern architecture was pretty much at its peak in Pakistan. Of course, in a lot of European countries, modern architecture had already gone through decades of evolution.